Morning everybody, Insights channel here, Steve. Today I thought I'd tell you a very interesting story. I'm going to read to you from the book of Job, chapter 38, at least some of it, and I can compare it with my latest book because it's rather similar as to the way God spoke to Ezra the prophet and the way he spoke to Job after they've both been through some terrible times, really terrible times, the worst possible times. In Job's case, great affliction, losing his whole family, and having his best friends taunting him and accusing him of being a sinner and bad, and he must have gotten afflicted by God because there's something wrong with him, or he's wicked, and they got it all wrong. And in the case of Ezra, he saw the destruction of Israel, and he saw his nation being the spiritual leader of Israel himself. He saw the destruction of Israel, and he saw them taken into slavery. He saw a lot of them slaughtered, etc. And he spent time fasting and praying, 40 days odd in all, in sessions of like 7 days at a time. And the strange thing about in both the case of Job and Ezra, when God did finally answer their prayers and came through very dramatically, I might say, and did he answer all their prayers? He did. It took time, and God did answer their prayers. Case of Ezra, Israel was delivered, and it took some time though. What I find interesting though is in both the case of Job and the prophet Ezra, God didn't answer their questions right away. God talked about anything from A to Z without necessarily getting round to what they were the most concerned about. Of course, they were both most concerned about their situation at that time. In Job's case, he was covered in boils and he was in a terrible situation, lost everything. What was God going to do about that? Well, of course, we know God did restore to Job everything, twice as much as he had before, and completely healed him, of course. And in Ezra's case, God did deliver Israel and used Ezra himself, along with Nehemiah, to rebuild Jerusalem, go back to Israel from the conquered nation under the Medo-Persians, first under the Babylonians, then the Medo-Persians. God did do great things and did deliver them, actually used Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and the wall, along with others. And so God did answer their prayers. But what I find interesting, look at this statement here by Ezra in my latest book, Esdras Insights. This is chapter 4, from creation. And then I answered and said, as Ezra speaking here, I beseech you, my Lord, why have I been endowed with the power of understanding? For I did not wish to inquire about the ways of above, but about those things which we daily experience. Why Israel has been given over to the Gentiles as a reproach, why the people whom you love has been given over to godless tribes, and the law of our fathers has been made of no effect, and the written covenants no longer exist. So that's how Ezra's seeing it at that particular moment. But you find as you read this book, my book, Esdras Insights, you'll find that God's angel comes back and God speaks to Ezra after each time of fasting for about 7 days at a shot, and he tells him secrets. And he especially talks about how God created things and the foundation of the world and how the world is going to end up. And he also describes how that the earth is hollow. And he says that the earth is like a womb. And he says these things on five different chapters, talking about how creation really is. I think it's wonderful. God's gone out of his way to tell people exactly how things are, and yet they still don't catch on. Today in modern science, they've got everything backwards. What they teach people in science is mostly false. They can't even tell you how the earth's designed. But of course that's by design, because unfortunately we're in a great big spiritual warfare where you have the negative spirit world and Satan deliberately hiding the truth in every area. Science, history, religion, you name it. Hides everything. Now, right now, I want to take you straight here to the book of Job. I was reading this yesterday and I found it absolutely fascinating. Because here in the book of Job, you can imagine, Job suffered all he has. He's covered in boils. He's practically withered away. He's got his so-called friends telling him he must be very wicked for God to judge him so bad, hanging around there. His wife said, "Why do you retain your integrity? Curse God and die." He doesn't do that. And all his children have died when the house collapsed on top of them. And so Job has been praying, sitting there and praying. And so then comes his third, and he states, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words?" Talking here to the counsels of Job, who are just spouting off mostly nonsense. Verse 3. It's funny, the angel says the same thing in 2nd Esdras, or in my book there, Esdras Insights. You say the same thing to Ezra. Stand up, be counted like a man. In other words, there's a time to stand up and listen and not be lying down on the defensive and worrying why things are so bad. It's time to stand up and be counted like a warrior. That's what God's saying to both his prophets. That's how we should be too. More ready to listen than to spew off complaints. God help us all. We're all guilty of that. But God likes us to be soldiers that can stand to attention and listen for a while God tells us something important far out of the range of our immediate sufferings and problems. I think that's why it happens in the case of Job and Ezra. It happened because there's few channels God has, there's few that are willing to listen. So when God does get your ear, he might not immediately answer what you're asking about. He might give you a history lesson from A to Z because he hasn't been able to get through before with his instructions. I think that's the reason why. So may the Lord help us all to stand to attention and listen when he wants to speak. And let's not be distracted by our own sorrows and pains, but to stand to attention and listen. We all have pains, we all have sorrows, but we need to learn to overcome it by the grace of God, by the power of God's Spirit, and by what says Jesus mentioned, the keys of the kingdom, which are so powerful. Continuing this chapter of Job 38, and God says to Job, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." God's telling Job how it was and how it started. Because I think what happens when people get into great sorrow, they start to analyze things in their mind as to why they've gotten in that predicament and what have they done wrong. And if you don't watch out, you've got Satan more than willing to come along and pour all his shit on your mind and tell you all kinds of crap about yourself and all kind of lies. And that's what God doesn't want you to do. He wants you to focus only on him and his word and the foundation stones of what God's done. Focus on what God has done. You get in times of trouble, focus by reading the word. That's why I always say, read the word every single day. Read the Bible every day. See what God's done. You want to get cheered up, you read the Psalms, you'll get cheered up real fast. I read John chapter 14, all about comfort. We all need that too. But we also need the ability to be able to listen to what God is trying to tell us. In this case, God is telling Job, you don't know much. For you being a wise man, and these three guys with you being wise men, you guys don't know much. Because you're not listening at the moment. You're listening to the negative, when you should proclaim the positive. And look at this verse that comes now. Now these are amazing verses that give away God's creation. Like what it says, same thing in the second Esdras, it's in my book, Esdras Insights, about the earth being hollow. The way it's described, the earth is described as not being solid, not being flat, but it's actually hollow. It has an inner sun, and it has entrances at the north and south, what they call the poles. There are holes to the inner surface, which is upside down relative to us, and the total crust of the earth is something like 400 miles thick. And by those who have investigated and those who have even been there, like Admiral Byrd, most decorated admiral of the United States, 1926 and 1947. So you can show these talks about how the earth is actually made, and in the book of Job 4,000 years ago. What this next verse says, and I'll describe the exact conditions it's talking about. Verse 8, so this is Job 38:8. Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? What is that talking about? Well, I'll tell you what it's talking about. If you consider the concept for a moment that the earth could be hollow, and that before the flood there wasn't much water. So let's just say that civilization was originally living inside the earth. They couldn't get to the outer surface of the earth through the hole in the north or south because there wasn't enough water to float a boat on. But as soon as the flood came along, Noah and his lot got in their ark and sailed happily out of one of the entrances, probably the northern entrance. They sailed right out. And thus is this description here, which is perfect. Or shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb. You look at a picture, you can see on Google Map the holes in the earth, the north and south. Although most of the time they cover it up, but if you're clever, you can show there are holes there. And you can find it from NASA and all kind of means you can find it. It's true. What does it look like? You look at the picture. If it doesn't look like a womb, like it says here. Or who shall shut up the sea with doors? That's another thing there, it says doors. Did you know that those who do get to see the holes in the poles, they say that sometimes you can see them, and sometimes it's like they're cloaked or camouflaged. Well, it doesn't surprise me, because if you study the Bermuda Triangles, you find out there's 12 of them, and they're all spaced at 30 degrees of a landmass, both laterally, in the northern hemisphere and the southern, and then there are 10 there, and then there's 2 more at the one each at the 2 poles. But as people have noticed who study the Bermuda Triangle, that sometimes they are indeed cloaked, or you can't see them. That is, it shows it's a spiritual thing. I've talked in my books about why those 12 Bermuda Triangles existed originally. And I think that God was the one who created them originally, but they weren't originally like they are now, where they don't function properly. They used to all be on a landmass and not in the sea. Most of them are in the sea now, don't function properly. Cause a lot of trouble for aviation and ships and all kinds of things of man that disappear. You know about the story of that disappearance. But right now I'm trying to bring out this thing about there are holes where the poles are supposed to be. And this verse in Job seems to allude to the breaking forth from such a hole at the time of the flood. Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? That could only have happened at the flood when there was suddenly lots of water coming down from up in the sky and breaking forth out of the ground, and finally the earth was flooded and the ship could come forth from the inner earth's surface to the outer surface. Incredible verse. So that's Job 38:8, and you'll find lots of verses similar to that in my book, my latest book, Esdras Insights. Verse 9. When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it. That is an exact description of what it's like at the northern entrance. Because what you see more than anything else, and why it's difficult to see up there, is because you've got hot air meeting very cold air, and it creates lots of clouds. As this verse is saying, when I made the cloud the garment thereof, and the thick darkness a swaddling band for it. In other words, through history you'll even see God himself, or even the fallen angels, what did they use to hide things? Clouds. That's what man does today. That's what you use chemtrails for. Cover up the place, make clouds so people can't see what's there. And you see many examples in the Bible like that, when God was covering something he was doing with a whole bunch of clouds. It's a good way of covering things up. And that's what it's talking about there, verse 9. Verse 10. And break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors. Again, yes, you've got things that are, why are they doors? They're portals. Another word for it is portals, like it says in the book of Enoch. Portals are basic dimensional gates, where things Einstein talked about. He says you can get places where dimensions overlap, and then you'd get portals, you'd get entrances where you can go from one dimension to another. That's scientific proof and fact. So we know they exist, these portals exist. And it's amazing how what's God telling Job after his terrible ordeal? He's saying, hey, go to the hospital and get patched up or get an operation. No. He's giving a lecture on how he created things, how things really are. Why? So that Job won't forget. He won't forget what he's been told. So he can tell others, how's it done? It saddens me that God goes out of his way to teach people how things really are in science and history, in religion, every topic. But they soon forget and soon believe lies. And they follow lies in every area. Very sad. Because they don't hold on to God's word. As simple as that. And I break up for it my decreed place and set bars and doors. There you go, you've got bars and doors where God's deliberately closing areas, making it so you can't get in or see it, stuff like that. All part of creation. And said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. And here thy proud ways shall be stayed. Also in 2nd Esdras it talks about this, where there are limits to things. There are control mechanisms, there are doors, there are portals. Talk about the same thing. Now, this chapter, it has got a lot in it, and I'm certainly not going to read any more, but it does have a lot of fantastic verses in it that you can dig out and find some other things. I'll maybe read a couple more because it's so fascinating, this chapter. It says things like this: hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the search of the depth? Have the gates of death been opened unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadows of death? Of course, if we know anything about the entrance to the north or the south, the inner earth used to be a good place. We used to have the Garden of Eden down there, according to Hebrew old scriptures and traditions. The Garden of Eden was down there. You can see that in the Torah. You can see that in the Zohar very clearly, that the Garden of Eden used to be inside the hollow earth. These are things you can find out for yourselves. It's not difficult. But look at these verses there that also apply to that, because what was a nice place is now turned into a hornet's nest, meaning the inner earth, and where the devil and his fallen angels hang out. And you know about that, death and hell and all that, lake of fire down there as well. I think there are physical dimensions and there are also spiritual dimensions down there. Have the gates of hell been opened unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? It couldn't be clearer. It's become hell down there. Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare it if thou knowest it all. This is a very interesting verse. I was thinking about this in science yesterday. Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Did you know that the earth is not, as we're given in a globe, that it's perfect at the poles and is broader at the middle of the earth, like the equator? Down it's wider. So if you did a circle from the North Pole right around vertically around the South Pole, that distance is less than the distance around the equator. So the earth is not perfectly like a globe, it's like a flattened globe. Well, it's saying that right here. It's saying exactly that. Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare it if thou knowest it all. Talk about measurement. Now, there's a lot more fantastic things in this chapter, but I'll just give you one more interesting verse here that I think fantastic. Yes, another one about the womb of the earth. Look at this. Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath gendered it? That's another thing. If you know about the northern entrance, when you go inside the Explorer City, you come to a big barrier of ice, a massive barrier of ice, and there's a place where there's no sun. You can't see the outer sun and you can't see the inner sun because it's like going through a tube of a few hundred miles long. And it tends to be dark down there, and the day and the night are different than normal, and there's areas where it's very, very cold. So that's how the earth's created. And as I said before, you can prove it too. If anybody does pottery can prove it. In pottery you have a spinning wheel and you're given a piece of clay. I used to do it. And you put your hands around the pottery, hold it on the spinning wheel, and your hands are forced out as a vessel is formed. And the first thing you notice about the vessel is it becomes hollow and it has holes at the bottom and the top. What should have been the difference with God creating the earth? So he's giving Job a science lesson on how he created the earth, how it really is created, how it was made, for those who got ears to hear and eyes to see. Again here, out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who had gendered it? The waters are hid as with a stone. The face of the deep is frozen. Well, that's exact description of the inner seas beyond the poles. Exactly how it is beyond the North Pole, exactly the ice barrier. And the next few verses talks about another subject people are very interested in, and that is, how do the stars affect us? God's talked about how he founded the earth, how it's made. Okay, it's hollow, it acts like a womb, okay, but it also talks about the stars here. These verses need investigating. They are fantastic. Well, why would God say this to Job unless it's important? Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season? Mazzaroth is talking about the 12 constellations of stars that affect the star signs. They're very personal on earth. Or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof on the earth? Okay, so that is just some of the verses out of Job chapter 38, where God is showing how he created things very clearly. There's no questioning it. God's just telling exactly how it is. And you'll find the same thing if you read my book, Esdras Insights, the latest book. It shows a lot of science in it. God shows how he made things, how it really is, not how you're falsely told by false science today. As is spoken clearly in the Bible, science falsely so called, 1 Timothy 6:20. So, I hope you enjoyed me bringing out Job 38 from what God was trying to tell Job. At least that's my opinion, that's what it's saying. You can have your opinion, you can think what you want. That's what I think it is in doing scientific study and studying many fields of science. You'll find there's lots of scientists and lots of doctors and lots of people do not agree with the status quo in their particular field. They find out everything. Scientists will tell you that themselves, but they're often stopped from saying what they really believe, under threat they lose their job, etc., etc. You know these things. But anyway, the truth's there, right there in the Bible. Just dig out the truth. It's right in your Bible, and as others have wisely said, and in the Apocryphal books. So know your Bible, know the King James Bible, that is, and the Apocryphal books. The Catholics are wise. They still got the Apocrypha in their Bibles, and also in the Orthodox Bible as well. Well, we should be reading them. So thanks for listening, everybody. I do encourage everybody, do get my latest Insights book, which is Esdras Insights. You can get it directly from me just by writing me Stephen with a ph.strut, S-T-R-U-T-T, at btinternet.com. You can get the book straight from me or from Amazon if you prefer. So thanks for listening, and also if you've got any comments, do send in some comments. I'll put some comments to this video. I'd love to hear from you. Anybody who writes to me, I'll send them a free PDF copy of my latest book. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.